Okay. Let's try this again.
Welcome to Forking Off, the podcast by former feds who got the fork out. I'm Jill Fields.
And I'm Philip Fields.
Now, before we get started, make sure to hit the follow button.
You can find all our content and show notes on our website, forkingoff.com.
And if you enjoy what we do and want to help, consider supporting us on Ko-fi. Hi, today's guest is Liz Ginexi. She was a senior program officer at NIH, National Institutes of Health, and managed millions of dollars in grant funding and research funding. But she retired last year. Actually, she retired early last year. She took the Vera VSIP. Since she left, she's been sharing the story that those on the inside can't share of what's been lost, what's been going on inside. Not just the loss of people, but the loss of experience, of innovation, relationships, and also the social and economic impacts. She started a Substack where she started sharing all these different stories and going through the data. She started back at the inauguration of the second Trump administration, and she said immediately there was a freeze on communications, a freeze on funding, a freeze on everything, basically.
Yeah, and we saw that at several other agencies where we talked to people as well, where they went after the communications staff, the IT staff. They told them they weren't allowed to talk to the public. It's the same pattern everywhere.
It is. It's
almost like there was some sort of coordinated plan going into this.
Like a project?
For 2025?
Yeah.
Huh.
So anyway, Philip, what you got?
When we talked to Liz, she told us about how they started pushing out career scientists, especially in leadership roles, and replacing them with political appointees who had anti-science viewpoints. She talked about how they had targeted and canceled grants, and they were using AI to find grants that referenced DEI. She also mentioned the sheer quantity of people who left. Liz mentioned that around 2,000 people retired early across the HHS.
Wow.
And she mentioned the April 1st rifts, which we also heard from people at CDC about, and how they lost 1,200 people in administrative, IT, and communications roles as a result of that. And I looked at some of the numbers too, because I'd been working on the OPM data project, and the numbers I came up with were pretty staggering. A lot of what Liz talked about, I think, mixed HHS and NIH, but just for the NIH, they lost 4,829 people between January of 2025.
That's almost 5,000 people.
And this is an agency that only had about 20,000 going into 2025.
So basically, you lost 1 out of every 4 or 5 people.
Yeah, they lost over 20% of their staff. It's actually a little surprising. Only 357 of those took the deferred resignation. The vast majority of the people that they lost were through retirements or rifts. Over 900 people resigned. 1,100 people had their appointments terminated. There were 807 reductions in force and over 1,800 retirements just in NIH.
Wow. That is a significant decrease, especially when you're looking at research, funding, national health initiatives.
Then when we talked with Liz, she framed that as the intentional rapid collapse of the premier biomedical research facility in the world. Yeah. And I still feel like maybe that doesn't convey the importance of this enough. There was a reduction in the number of awards that they were granting during that time as well. They granted 20% fewer awards during 2025 than in previous years. That's a major downsizing, but Liz also will talk about the notice of funding opportunities, which is how they solicit research from the public. In an average year, she mentioned that they do 650 to 860 of these notice of funding opportunities. At the time that we had talked to Liz for 2026, they had done 14.
That's a dramatic difference.
Yeah. And the other thing that really stood out, we saw this at the Bureau too, but it was interesting hearing it from somebody else. She talked about how leadership complied in advance at the beginning of the administration, when they started receiving pressure to entertain these anti-scientific directives and shift research focus away from important cancer treatments and things like that. They just said, okay. it's like they thought that by complying, they might be able to protect themselves. They claimed that they could help protect their people. But as we've seen, it didn't really shake out that way. And a
Yeah, it
lot of
doesn't
those
seem like
people
it.
were removed anyways.
Yeah, it's really sad, but it's really interesting, and it's something that I don't think most Americans, me included, realized how much of an impact NIH has on just our everyday life. The economic impact, Liz will go through the numbers, but it's in the billions, and it creates hundreds of thousands of jobs every year just through the grant funding and the research that happens through NIH. So now let's hear from Liz. Let's jump to the interview.
All right.
So today we have with us Elizabeth Ginexi. Hi, Liz. How are you?
Greetings. I'm well, thanks.
I'm excited to have you on here because I've looked at your Substack. I've read several of these articles about NIH, and I really want to go into this. But before we do, let's get started with your bluff, your bottom line up front.
Perfect. So I'm Elizabeth Ginexi. You can call me Liz. I was a scientific program official at the National Institutes of Health for 22 years. And I took the early retirement offer, which is also called VERA, in April of 2025.
22 years. That is impressive. Tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to NIH and to public service.
Yeah, great. Yes, 22. It feels like a lifetime. I went to graduate school to become an applied social psychologist. My dream was to be a professional scientist who could seek and generate evidence based on insights that would promote health and well-being for everybody here in our country. Rather than becoming a clinician, what I wanted to do was help society to better understand the social and psychological phenomenon in all of its complexity, and then kind of use those insights to help people's mental health, help their behavioral issues, and focus on these things in more systematic and distal ways rather than just individual treatments, and get kind of larger societal solutions for these sorts of problems. Traditionally, social psychologists are the type of people who would do very controlled laboratory experiments with very narrow populations like college students. And that's not the kind of research I wanted to do. I wanted to do research in real world settings where we could affect behavioral change in communities, schools, states, and so forth. And that's a really hard science to do. Because the world's complex, the data has to be complex. And that's why throughout my 5 years of graduate school and then 3 years as a postdoc, I spent a lot of time seeking out all kinds of training opportunities for how to deal with complex, multi-level, longitudinal, messy data. It was an exciting time because in the 90s and the early 2000s, we got all sorts of advanced computing capabilities and new statistical software and modeling software. So it was just a dream to immerse myself in all this complex data. As a result, that analytic focus really shaped my career trajectory. I wound up getting a job at a local research company called Westat. I spent a few years there leading analyses for large national substance abuse treatment and prevention studies. And that was really basically to help inform the evidence base for what works and what doesn't work to help people avoid the horrors of substance use disorders. So after the doubling years of the budget for the NIH, this was during the Clinton administration, there was a dire need for more help properly directing the science in these areas to maximize return on investment for public health at the NIH. And a few colleagues of mine suggested that I apply to an opening at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And I thought, all right, I'll give it a shot. And lo and behold, they wanted someone with my analytic expertise and training. And so I began my career at the NIH in July of 2003. I didn't know it then, but I would stay there for the next 22 years, growing my expertise as a scientific steward of the taxpayer's investment in biomedical and behavioral research. Maybe I should step back because maybe some of your listeners don't really know what the National Institutes of Health really does. It is, or at least it was, the largest funding agency of biomedical research in the world. The United States is a premier expert for any and all basic, applied, and clinical research for many decades. And in addition to leading the way in developing cures, treatments, advancements in health, it actually had a really tremendous impact on the economy of the country and the workforce as well. So a lot of people may not know, in 2024, every $1 of investment in NIH funding generated approximately $2.56 in economic activity. And that's because it creates jobs. So in 2024, there were over 400,000 in jobs that were created. It generated more than $94.5 billion in economic activity. We provided all the science for almost all of the drugs that go through FDA approval and that are then make billions for the pharmaceutical industry. It's just been not only tremendous for advancing health, but really making us an economic powerhouse as well. So back to kind of what I worked on specifically at the NIH. As you may know, substance use and behavioral addictions impact health and economic costs to society quite horribly, and they drain about $740 billion a year from the United States economy. This is impacting chronic disease, premature death, lost productivity, theft, violence, and then there's the back-end costs of law enforcement, prosecution, incarceration. Public health initiatives were really designed to attack this from the health side. We've used principles that we've developed over many decades in addiction science to address these issues and basically reduce the overall burden of alcohol, tobacco, and other substance use. Starting in the latter part of the 20th century, the government through NIH and other sources started really funding this work, and including other addictions like gambling. We have grown to a huge community of scientists with over 100 specialized scholarly journals focused on these problems, scores of professional societies, and then well over 200 research centers, all really training the future practitioners and scientists to continue to focus on these important areas. Of course, all of these accomplishments are now being flushed down the drain. We had tremendous accomplishments, including vast decreases in cigarette smoking and addiction, saving lives for cancer prevention, and on and on and on. But we've decided now that this is not really worth our money. That's where we are at this moment. We're at the precipice. Are we going to continue caring about substance use? I don't know. We need a sustained effort, and I'm afraid we're losing that.
It does seem like there's some steam that has been lost. So you said earlier you took Vera in April. What prompted that?
That is a great question. And to this day, I'm still wondering, but I can maybe backdrop that because I began at the NIH in 2003. I had worked there through transitions of several administrations. Each time they would come in, there might always be some changes or some quirky things that went on, and including in the first Trump administration where there were some bizarre goings on, but nothing that was designed to dismantle the agency. So that was the backdrop. I thought, oh, now we're going to have more wacky things again, but we'll live through this just like we did last time, because the NIH historically has had bipartisan support. Most people want cures for cancer. Most people want us to improve public health. Smoking, for instance, kills upwards of 500,000 people a year in the United States. Most people want us to do this work. We weren't doing anything that was particularly controversial as far as I knew. So I thought, oh, we're just going to have to do it some nonsense, but all's well that ends well. Things will be fine at the NIH because everybody loves the NIH. However, COVID kind of changed all that. I didn't realize at the time in January after Trump was inaugurated that this was going to be the wedge that would be used to eliminate things at the NIH. So for readers who want to delve deep, go into Project 2025 and look up the section on the NIH. And what you will see is a philosophy of disdain for the agency that was really not taken seriously by anybody, certainly not any of us in the NIH. We thought some cuckoo hates us, but nothing will happen, right? So it was a sort of disbelief. That's not how it turned out. Within a day of the inauguration, the craziness of a level I've never seen before started to unfold. We had a memo sent to us from HHS through our email on January 21st, which ordered us to freeze all of our communications, all of our meetings, all of our granting, everything. We were essentially told, full stop, you're not allowed to communicate with the public. You're not allowed to hold grant reviews. You're not allowed to issue any new announcements of any kind. Everything was going to be reviewed. And until the new administration did a thorough review of everything, we should all just shut up and don't do anything.
Wow. It's one thing to say, like, okay, let's pause on grant reviews. It's one thing to say, okay, we're not going to issue grants at this moment, but to say no and don't communicate any of this, there's no transparency there.
It was bizarre. We then had to cancel all of our meetings. As scientists, we typically go to conferences, we hold workshops, we hold webinars, all kinds of things. Everything, boom, canceled. We weren't even allowed to tell people why we were canceling. We just had to cancel everything. It was bonkers. But then it got worse. We only had two political appointees at the NIH director and the NCI director. Usually, historically, what would happen is, within a day or so of an inauguration, if the actual NIH director thought that they weren't going to be held over, they would tender their resignation and their role would be relegated to the acting, who would be a career scientist who really knows the organization and could run things until the next appointee would be seated. And in this case, that was Larry Tabak. But instead of having this experienced scientist run the agency, they pushed him out and appointed a handpicked person named Matthew Memley, who was a very little known at NIH. And the reason why they chose him, apparently, is because he was a COVID denier and was lauded by many right-wing groups for his views, and apparently became quite chummy with Jay Bhattacharya and a number of other of these COVID deniers. You can imagine where things were going. Things kind of unraveled similarly to other agencies. We got the fork in the road email at the end of January, but then they started pushing out the established leaders one by one. So Larry Tabak, who should have been the acting NIH director, was pushed out on February 12th. Then next out was Mike Lauer. He was the director of the Office of Extramural Affairs, many years of service, pushed out. And then RFK Jr. was confirmed by the Senate. On February 14th, we had the probationary firings where they identified anybody who had a probationary status as a civil servant and sent them walking and told them all it was for bad performance when it was not. And then we started getting the email where Doge wanted us to tell them what we did last week in 5-bullet form, which we had to do for many weeks. It was crazy. All of this was happening in the context of pretty much every day there was some new fresh hell of things that we had to do and things we were not allowed to do. We were still not allowed to talk to our investigators that we funded. We were still not allowed to go to meetings. We were still not allowed to fund grants. We were still not allowed to have grant reviews. Our business was coming to a full stop with really no indication when it would end. All the while, we would get more and more emails telling us of things coming down the pike. And then the HHS reorganization plans landed and were leaked by some sources, where we learned that RFK was basically planning to fully restructure the entire agency, including the NIH. Basically wanted to cut the HHS staff from about 82,000 to about 62,000 in one fell swoop and reorganize everything. The office where I was working at the time was NCCIH, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, where I was working on non-pharmacological approaches to treat pain, hence keeping people off of opioids. And we were implementing treatments in the military health system to help veterans and military personnel. My center was on the list to be deleted as no longer necessary. So I was kind of reading the tea leaves and thinking, maybe my job is going to be going away. But the other thing that was really notable about this time was that the NIH leadership was silent. Our leaders were going along with it all and assuring us that things would be fine. It'll be fine, no worry. And even in my offices and some of the others that I had contact with, they thought, well, we should just try and create some scientific initiatives that align with the MAHA movement and everything will be fine. And so I recall being in these meetings where we were being asked to come up with suggestions for how we could meet the needs of RFK Jr.'s MAHA, which is bonkers to me. This is not science. I'm not going to create an initiative to look at food dye and how autism is caused by vaccines. Get out of here. So this is what was going on in those early months where the leadership of NIH just refused to believe that anyone would dismantle their agency, but just maybe if we just go along to get along, we'll be fine.
Can I ask a question about that? Because some people will hear that and say, well, you didn't want to do the research. But prior to this administration, how would NIH normally decide what they do and don't do research on? Have there been instances in the past where a political appointee comes in and is like, you need to stop working on that initiative and work on this one when there's no grounds for it? How does that work?
The way that NIH would develop its initiatives or focus areas was with deep engagement with the scientific research community. We had several layers that we do this. Each of the 27 institutes and centers has advisory committees, which are comprised of scientists in those areas of science for each disease and condition which they oversee. So we can consult these advisory councils. We can also convene special committees, special reports. We can engage with the National Academies of Science, which we did many times, where we would ask them to do a study, a synthesis of particular scientific areas and identify gaps. So these were the traditional ways that we would survey through the means of engaging with the scientific community. What are the pressing needs? As well as, at least in COVID, looking around and seeing what the emergent 911 issues were, right? So obviously during the pandemic, we didn't have to ask people if we should develop a vaccine. We kind of figured that out on our own, right? But most of the time, it's through watching the epidemiological trends, consulting with our colleagues at CDC, at FDA, at the other science agencies, and with deep democratic engagement with the scientific community.
So presumably, if there were some strong scientific evidence that Tylenol was causing autism or measles vaccines were actually bad for you, you would have already been aware of that and working on solutions, right? You wouldn't need RFK Jr. to come in and tell you, drop everything and focus on these issues.
Absolutely. And not to mention that there have been decades of studies that have looked into the link between autism and vaccines, and much of that was funded by the NIH. And the dozens and dozens of analyses into that question have produced null findings, meaning no effects. So we don't want to spend money on questions that we already have answers to. That's a waste of the taxpayers' dollars, and that's a waste of our time. But here we were in the face of the new administration, and suddenly I saw the leaders at NIH sort of kowtowing. It was bizarre. There's this whole idea of on tyranny, don't comply in advance. And that's what I saw them doing. That let's just placate and perhaps we'll come out fine on the end. And I personally knew that that would not succeed. So I guess my first reaction when I saw that fork in the road email was, they can drag me out kicking and screaming. I'm never leaving this job. Once I saw that there was no leadership that was going to back us up, my faith in what I could do diminished. And I knew that I was not a supervisor. I was not a division director. I was not an institute director. I was just a program scientist. And I did not have the power to push back in the ways that they did. So eventually they started canceling our grants. This was illegal. They had the Doge boys using perhaps ChatGPT or some AI tool to scan the grants for words that they were calling DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, which was never defined to us. And so we would start receiving spreadsheets of our grants to be canceled. And our task was to go through these spreadsheets and justify why these grants who went through scientific peer review and were deemed meritorious and have already been funded, in some cases for 1 to 4 years, that suddenly we're going to cancel their funding. And why should we keep these grants? And we would spend our time writing justifications that were ignored. And so they would cancel the grants anyway. once I realized that this was going to become my full-time job, providing justifications for non-scientific political decisions, I started questioning about whether it would be worthwhile to stay. And then the last straw for me, there was a right-wing group that created what was called a quote DEI watch list. And what they did was they went through the Health and Human Services directories and identified scientists, mostly people of color, who they would then feature on this website and put all of their private information about them and basically demonize them as being DEI advocates. It was very threatening. Their goal was to have all of these people fired. And I had some very good friends who were placed on this list. And here's where I could kind of get emotional. And one of my good friends was threatened. Her family was threatened. Their home was doxxed. The local police really couldn't help them much. They can't surveil their house. I mean, what are they going to do? And her NIH leadership did nothing for her. No one cared. And it was at that point that I said, not only is the leadership not going to push back on the anti-scientific political takeover of the agency, they're not even concerned about protecting us as human beings. My job as a scientist is no longer valued. I'm prevented from doing my job. And instead, I have been told that my new job is to implement DOGE principles. And that's when I started realizing that it was time to think about getting out. And when the Vera offer came out on March 7th, I started seriously considering it. It was after the probationary firings, but before the April 1st massacre, where they came in and riffed a mass riff of HHS. We lost another maybe 1,200 people that day, and they fired 4 institute directors that day. They eliminated administrative staff, all of our IT staff, all of our communication staff, our procurement staff. They even got rid of our payroll people. I came in that day, everyone was crying, and we didn't even know if we were going to get our paychecks because they eliminated the people that would do that paperwork for our payroll. It made no sense to me. People were told that they had 20 minutes to gather their things and get the hell out. They were told they were not allowed to transfer their work, not have an orderly shutdown, but just get out. They were treated with such disrespect. And still, the NIH leadership clutched their pearls and said, things will be okay. Don't worry, we'll be fine. So in the end, approximately 2,000 NIH employees like me chose the early retirement because we could see the writing on the wall. And if you had at least 20 years of service, and if you were over 50 years of age, that's the magical OPM number where you can qualify. And for me, I thought about it really hard. And I said, look, if I stay, I'm not going to be able to be quiet. I'm going to fight back and they're going to fire my ass. So I said, if I get fired, I really get nothing. But if I take the Vera, I get to keep my health insurance for myself and my husband, and I get to keep my teeny tiny pension. And I can just ride off into the sunset and hopefully get a job on the outside. And for me, that seemed like the better bet. And I also figured that things would just get worse from there on out. And in fact, they have. So right now, the NIH is in a full state of collapse.
Yeah, it is. We've seen that with other people that we've talked with Sarah Degu and Anna Mitchell from CDC, who were part of all of that.
And Molly at the patent office had a very similar story as well.
Yes.
Like this
yes.
isn't, it was across
Yeah, the
government.
communication, the cut off all communication, cut off all of this, cut off all of that. I mean, Andrew had that at EPA, and he was even told not to talk to the Congress members that he
was
was
dealing
supposed
with
to be
grants
helping.
also.
But you left, but you've written some really great pieces, like what happens when we're asked to pretend it's normal. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what you've been doing and how you've been advocating to educate the U.S. about everything that's been lost?
Yes. Yeah, this has been challenging. I think there were about 20% of NIH that are now gone in terms of the staff. And I was having nightmares during the Doge time. I kept having nightmares that I was going to be fired for maybe they would find out that I voted for Kamala Harris and they would fire me, which is a funny nightmare to have. But even after I left the NIH, one of the reasons why I started writing was I was having recurring dreams. And I still have this dream today. I'm back in a conference room with all my scientific colleagues, and we're working together on some really important new things. And then someone stands up and points at me and says, she's not supposed to be here. She took the Vera. Get her out of here. and then I wake up. Clearly, I haven't coped well with losing my career of 22 years. And I started working with an advocacy group called the Addiction Science Defense Network. That was really impactful for me because looking for a job was just pure hell. The job market in the DC metro area is just unreal because we have thousands of these professionals all out of work looking for the very few jobs that are available. So in between looking for work, which was completely demoralizing, I joined this group. These are some scientists that I knew from having worked in addiction science for many, many years. And what they were working on was trying to write a full impact report of the effect of the first year of the Trump administration on addiction science and treatment in America. And I had some unique capabilities to do data analysis for them, leveraging some of the publicly available data from the NIH because I understand the data so well. The NIH Reporter is one such source where you can track all the grants that are funded. There are other databases that push out what are called funding opportunities. So this is how the scientific community can respond to NIH needs and send in grants. And they call those notice of funding opportunities, or NOFOs for short. So in part of the confusion, purposeful, they started changing how they record a lot of this data and how a lot of this data is tracked. So without specialized knowledge of what they were doing and when they were doing it, it made understanding some of these data tricky, but I had that knowledge. So for instance, in the NIH Reporter data, you would have to know a little bit about the fiscal year and how the grant notice of award dates are coded, chart those. And then they started implementing at the direction of Russell Vogt, what they called a multi-year funding strategy. And basically, to describe this, the way I would say is NIH budgets were allocated annually. And so what we typically did was, even though if you were an investigator and you had a 5-year project, we would give you the money 1 year at a time. Each year, we would ask you to submit a scientific progress report that people like me would read and make sure that the progress is on point. And then we would give you your next year's worth of money. That system worked quite well because we had good oversight and we could spend our money in the year that it was allocated. After holding up funding of grants for most of 2025, there was a large bolus of money left over. It was the end of the year was upon them. And in order to get enough of this money out in time, Russell Vogt and his team in OMB ordered that the NIH implement what's called a multi-year funding approach, which instead of giving you 1 year of your money for your 5-year project, let's give you an award that has all 5 years at once. People might say, oh, okay, what's wrong with that? Well, it's math. In the past, we could fund 5 grants and give them all $500,000 in the 1 year. Now, if we give that same $500,000 a year all up front in a 5-year swoop, you diminish the overall number of awards that you're able to give out to the public. They saw a vast I think somewhere in the order of 20% reduction in the number of awards that they issued last year. So that means fewer labs are getting money, fewer scientists are getting money, fewer potential cures are being examined, less clinical trials are ongoing, and labs are closing. So all that job creation and economic output that we talked about earlier in the show has been shrunk by vast amounts. You have to know a little bit about that to crunch the data. So I helped produce some data that's going to come out in our report that should be released in May, and we're going to have a big presser about it. So it should be exciting. I did some analysis on the NIH Reporter data to show the impacts of these strategies. And then I also did some analysis on the vast decline on notice of funding opportunity releases, which are now being severely controlled by the political appointees at the NIH. In the meantime, I also started writing this Substack. I thought, maybe no one will care, but it was incredibly therapeutic for me to start describing what I did at the NIH. What is a program official and why should anybody care? To my surprise, there is a little bit of traction, and then more people got interested and more people got interested. Now my posts are going viral. And just this week, I decided to post some of my analysis about the notice of funding opportunities. And I demonstrated basically how that whole system has collapsed with a very simple chart that shows you in very dramatic form, no statistics required, how they are now eliminating the role of the program officials and the role of the agencies to determine the science. And it's completely being controlled now and directed by Russell Vogt at OMB.
We'll link to this specific post. If you look at the NIH NOFOs published over time, which is the first figure, there was a spike in 2017 with 1,110, but every other year has ranged anywhere from 650 to 860. But what's most shocking is you go from seeing numbers like 714, 693, 756, and then to 2025, you see 120. And 2026, you see 14.
To put that in context, 14, there are 27 institutes and centers at the NIH. So what that means is we have fewer announcements than we actually have centers and institutes for this year so far. Now, critics will argue, why should these bureaucrats at the NIH be the ones who decide what the science is? Why don't we just let the investigators submit the ideas that they want? Why are we always telling them what to do? And this argument fails because they can always do that. For as long as NIH has existed, there are mechanisms where you can apply literally any health idea that you want unsolicited to the NIH and will get reviewed. And in fact, every year they fund plenty of these. The other piece of it is that at a national level, public health benefits when you have a scientific community surveying nationally and even worldwide, what are the health gaps? No one institution or one lab can do that. That's the role of federal government. When we can take this big picture view. As an example, after 2009, when Congress gave FDA the authority to regulate tobacco products, the law stipulated that the regulation must be driven by science. However, we didn't have the science that the FDA needed to make any rules. So they asked the NIH and the FDA to partner up and make this happen. So I was one of a couple of program officials who were tasked with creating the scientific infrastructure that would inform regulatory authority at the FDA. So we set up a very large center grant program to investigate all of the particular product information that they would need to know to properly set the rulemaking. The money was given to us by FDA, which was collected from the tobacco industry in users' fees. So this isn't even taxpayer money. Our job was to figure out how to create the scientific infrastructure for this. And we set up a large nationally spread out center grant program and a training pipeline so that we could basically make a whole new area of regulatory science for this purpose. You cannot do that with unsolicited investigator-initiated grants. You have to write a funding opportunity announcement. We needed to follow the rules. We needed to specify what FDA needed. We needed to make sure the applications were targeting those specific areas. And you cannot do that unless you're writing a funding opportunity. So the idea that we don't need funding opportunities to tackle important public health problems is just a nonsense argument.
Looking at all of this, how much more impact do you see this having? And how long do you see it taking to rebuild from this, if it's possible to rebuild?
The NOFO's decline was something I could write about and visualize because it's quite easy to understand. But there are many other, I kind of call it the 1,000 paper cut technique, trying to kill the NIH. And right now, my colleagues who are still there are still busy trying to justify their applications against DEI claims. They're spending most of their time doing that to the point of ridiculousness. One colleague told me they work in basic science, so the study of cellular level processes. And when you study cells, you have to use particular biological assays. Some of these assays are made by pharmaceutical companies and the products have strange names. And there's one assay that has a component in it that is called LGBT. And it keeps getting flagged for DEI. So tell me again how they're not really using AI to screen applications. So they're still making the poor scientists chase their tails doing this nonsense work. They're writing NOFOs that are going nowhere. They're continuing to centralize the NIH. What do I mean by that? We used to have the Center for Scientific Review, which did about 60% of the application reviews for the NIH, and the rest were done within the institutes, because if you are going to be looking at a very specialized cancer cure, you need cancer scientists, oncologists to review those. And let's just have some specialized review study sections within the National Cancer Institute that already know how to do that. So when RFK Jr. came in and Doge came in, they decided that the institutes should no longer be allowed to do review on special topics. So they pushed all those people out and made them all either leave their jobs or join the Center for Scientific Review to have centralized NIH review. And then get rid of all the comms people, centralized communications, so that all the voices can come right out of the NIH director and controlled. Centralize all the IT and all of the people who do anything related to technology control, make sure that those people are centralized. Centralize the money control, so they control what can get funded. Everything's been centralized. They got rid of all the social media accounts for all the 27 institutes and centers. They're no longer allowed to have them. There's one social media account that's managed by political people. And I feel like this is all a march toward essentially making the 27 institutes become less and less relevant so that they can start consolidating them and eliminating them one by one. That's where I think we're headed here, and they have a few more years to do it. So we'll see what happens. But I don't see how anything's going to get better. I think it's just going to slowly chip away until they centralize control of everything. In Project 2025, what their wish was to essentially eliminate the NIH and just turn it into a block grant program where every state gets an amount of dollars that they could spend however they want. And we could probably have a whole podcast on why that's a bad idea. But because they need Congress to do that and they can't accomplish that, I think this is what they've decided is the next best thing. Just centralize and diminish the NIH, take control away from the individual institutes and centers, take control away from the scientists, the career scientists, and put that control into political hands. So right now, the NIH, which was never controlled by political people, is wholly controlled by political people.
And that's terrifying. I don't want a teacher to be my general practitioner, my doctor, because they didn't get the training.
Comparing RFK Jr. to a teacher is a bit generous. I'd probably compare him more to my high school wrestling coach.
Okay, yeah, that works.
What they're doing now is starting to name unqualified people to the leadership roles at the NIH. And I think that trend will continue. So, for example, one of the institutes, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, they installed a former roommate buddy of J.D. Vance to lead that organization.
Yes, I saw that.
Yes, and that is not how institute directors have ever been named prior to that announcement. There was no vetting. There was really not even an announcement of the job. And each of the institutes has these advisory councils, which I mentioned before, and they're comprised of scientists with expertise in the given disease and condition areas. And they have previously been basically nominated by NIH institutes and centers. And then there's a little sign off by HHS, which was never a problem in the past. But now HHS refuses to sign off on these people. So the council terms are generally about 3 years and then they cycle off. So most of the councils, which are required by law to help approve the final slate of grants for funding, are woefully deficient in the number of required scientists. And at some point, many of those councils won't have enough people left to actually issue grants anymore by law. So I have it on good authority from friends at the National Institute of Mental Health. They are trying to install a couple of RFK-minded people who are against any and all psychiatric medications and put them onto the Advisory Council for Mental Health to start to dismantle the idea that we should have any medications available to treat mental disorders. We're going to have political people and quacks, and it's gotten out of hand. The NIH director, Jay Bhattacharya, who was appointed to NIH, has also been appointed to lead CDC right now, which these are two jobs that should not be done by one person. They're just turning the NIH into a non-scientific political organization. As a perfect example is Jay Bhattacharya has started the new Freedom Lecture at NIH, where he's invited the inaugural speaker, who is a name by the name of Matthew Ridley. He's a member of British aristocracy who did his PhD in pheasant mating, but has since come up with lots of theories about how COVID was started by a lab leak. And he wrote a book about it, and he's going to come talk about it. So this is the kind of science lecture we're now being forced to hear at the NIH.
The thing is, I want to laugh because it's so ridiculous.
Yeah,
But
it's
then
like
it also
funny.
makes me want to cry because this is so ridiculous.
So yes, the Onion headline is like, the NIH director has asked a British hereditary peer with a doctorate in pheasant mating to defend his do-nothing pandemic preparedness playbook by spreading fascist conspiracy theories about how the pandemic started.
I really hope there's a water painting of a guy in a checkered suit on a horse with some dogs.
So, I mean, my friends who are still there are all saying, well, they may go to the lecture and stage a walkout where, kind of fill the auditorium. And then after 2 minutes in of the speech, just stand up and everybody leaves. So they might do that. Things are bad. My main sadness is that ordinary Americans do not know that this is happening. And many, if I tell them, they don't really understand it or they don't really fully appreciate the loss. And maybe that's because the true loss is not going to be found for years. The fact that we're not funding a new innovative cure for cancer today doesn't really matter today. It's going to matter 5 or 10 years from now when that rare form of cancer doesn't have that treatment that we could have started today. And it's that future possibility and that future hope and that future discovery that we're going to be losing. And now we'll have to count on China or some other nation, possibly Europe, to generate those cures.
I don't think, not even just the average American, but the average person really puts a lot of time and energy into thinking about the connections between scientific research and their everyday life. So they're just not thinking about these things. And so we do have to think about how we protect those people without them ever even having to be aware that it's happening. We want them to be aware. We want them to be involved and engaged. But
That's right.
What can the scientific community do in the absence of this is the other part of it. We talked about brain drain and people going to Europe and other places to try and continue research. That's not good for the US economy, but protecting humanity versus protecting shareholder interests at a pharmaceutical company, I'll go with humanity.
Right.
What can we do?
Scientists, we're not trained to be activists. We're trained to do data analysis and write a paper and get it peer reviewed and debate the pros and cons of our analytics and that sort of thing. But this is called for new times, and people are starting to stand up and do the right thing. There's an organization that folks can look up to and hopefully help support called Stand Up for Science, which was started by a group of people who believe that the time of writing letters of concern is over. We have to do more radical things to save science. And that not only that, but democracy and science are linked. You can't have a vibrant scientific community if you don't have a vibrant democracy. Science really uses a lot of principles from democratic processes in our science. So one lab doing one study is not enough. You have to have the findings debated by the community, the consensus is developed, and you make the case for your findings based on what you've done. And that's not that different than how we're ideally supposed to come to consensus in how we govern ourselves. If you have censorship, if you have political control, if you have banned words, you're not going to be doing proper science. So we need to defend not only democracy, but science at the same time. Why not kill two birds with one stone? In fact, we really have no choice unless we prefer to live in a country that's an authoritarian one, in which case we can just accept it. But I'm not in that camp. So people should look for Stand Up for Science, support them, look for similar organizations who are fighting. There are plenty of them. Defend Public Health is another one. Other smaller groups who are working, the Addiction Science Defense Network, which I'm part of. We're all connected. We're trying to teach people that we need to advocate in multiple fronts talking to our Congress people. Get out the vote is going to be critical for the midterms and beyond. And teaching people how to speak about science in ways that ordinary people can understand, and really articulating, why should we care? Why do we want to be the biomedical research leader of the world? Why is that in our best interest? And making that case to your friends, your family, people who may not otherwise hear it.
Looking back, like, what would it take for you to go back to NIH?
It's a sad question, but I think the only thing that would make me want to go back is if it could be depoliticized and we could get to a place where they would want scientific experts to help them rebuild. And I don't see that coming for a really long time. The other thing is that when I left, they offered the monetary incentive called the VSIP, where they could give you an extra $25,000 to leave. And because I figured I'd be unemployed for quite a while, I signed up for that too. So I took the VERA and the VSIP. And when you take the VSIP, you have to sign away and say that if you ever want to come back to federal government, you have to give them the $25,000 back. It would have to be a really compelling argument to make me want to pay the government $25,000 to work for them again. And I suppose there could be some targeted legislation from the Hill if they ever wanted to absolve people of that responsibility in the future. But as it stands right now, the chances of me going back are probably zero.
Yeah. Well, Liz, is there anything else you want to add today?
Oh, I think we covered a pretty wide range. I'll try and stay motivated to keep putting new developments on Substack, because I don't think this is the last of what we are going to hear coming out of the NIH over the next 6 months to several years. I think we haven't seen the worst of it yet.
That is scary. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for forking off with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful following all these stories. Your podcast has just been enlightening and tragic at the same time. Thank you.
Wow. That is a lot.
Yeah.
And there's more. I mean, we could have talked with Liz for hours about this impact and the implications of everything that has happened.
Yeah, I still can't get over a lot of what she talked about, how the reductions in funding are going to force labs to close.
Yeah.
That's going to have an impact across not just the American economy. That's going to ring throughout the world. She mentioned it threatens the economic engine that generated over $94 billion in 2024 alone. 400,000 jobs in 1 year.
And it's impacting education as well. There have been multiple universities and research institutions that have frozen admissions for PhD candidates in these biological sciences. Harvard put a freeze on. I want to say like Boston University put a freeze on theirs. This is going to have an impact not just today, but in the future and to innovation.
We're already seeing people talking about going to Europe or even China to be able to continue doing research. Those are all very bad things for the US economy. Ideally, the work still gets done somewhere, but in reality, this isn't just a numbers problem. This is going to be a problem 5 or 10 years from now when the science that was being done today hasn't been happening and somebody needs some rare cancer treatment that was never developed. The impact of this is not even going to be felt the hardest for 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, we've heard it from so many of our guests. We've mentioned it as well with our own stories. We are not going to grasp this for years. We will just get the glimmer in 5 years.
The average American before last year didn't really put a lot of thought into how scientific research impacts their everyday life. We don't think about those types of things.
We're already starting to see some of that in the news with talk of changing vaccine schedules, talk of different research. We're not going to research this. We're going to research. One of them was like the nicotine.
Oh, the one about how nicotine gives you energy? Was that it?
Yes.
It's like Red Bull gives you wings for cigarettes.
Yes.
And for me, the other thing that I want to touch on that Liz mentioned, and I think Liz has been sort of leading the way and really setting a great example, but she mentioned how scientists aren't trained to be activists.
Right.
And I want to push back on that a little. I fully believe that within the federal sort of scientific community, there is a very neutral, sterile approach to science that attempts to keep any sort of outside influence away. But historically, it doesn't have to be that way. And I think it's time for scientists to remember some of that and get more involved, like Liz was encouraging. We can go back as far as the Enlightenment period with Sir Isaac Newton. Throughout history, Sir Francis Bacon and Leonardo da Vinci in the Renaissance was a revolutionary. These people weren't just doing science in a vacuum, they were changing the course of history. It's not all like ancient history. Look at Rachel Carson with Silent Spring and how she started the modern environmental movement. Rachel Carson wasn't just an author. She had a master's from Johns Hopkins. These people were pushing society forward through scientific thinking. And that's what we need right now, especially from everybody who is feeling the effects of this in the scientific community. Everybody has to get involved. And if you're not in that community, we need to recognize what we're losing and support these people and help them to push us forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree 100%. We need to support those communities and we need to support that innovation. Speaking of like pushing forward and really advocating, it was our scientific community. It was NIH that was actually pushing for the mRNA vaccines. They came up with a vaccine in a record amount of time. The vaccine slowed the spread of COVID. It didn't stop it because it wasn't going to be stopped.
It didn't stop it because people refused to take it and refused to mask and were throwing COVID parties.
Oh my gosh, I know. While we sat at home going, please stay away from us. But they were leading the way, and that's what we need. We need innovation. We need to be looking for new things. And with this administration trying to slowly strip the autonomy of the 27 institutes at NIH, we're losing expertise.
That sort of goes back to that idea that they removed the IT people, the administrators, the comms people. They did all of this to consolidate political power over the science. And that is a very authoritarian thing to do.
Yeah.
History does not bode well for societies that stand by while this happens.
But like you mentioned, there are things we can do. What can we do? We can get involved. We can financially and politically support these organizations. Liz mentioned some just a few minutes ago. They're on social media. We can share on our social media. We can be there. Even if we're not doing the science ourselves, we can support the scientists.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to just be grassroots donors supporting science. This is an opportunity for business to step in and invest in an industry that has pushed the U.S. forward.
Yeah, it's what we need. So get out there, support science. Take a look at Liz's Substack. She is sharing some really great things. She mentioned the project that is going to be coming out in May. As soon as that is available, we will highlight that. Just be looking, be mindful, pay attention to what's going on out there.
Do science.
Do science. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for forking off with us.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Forking Off.
If you're a former Fed with a story to tell, or you're wrestling with your own ethical crossroads, reach out to us at info@forkingoff.com.
Today's episode was created, produced, and edited by Jill and Philip Fields. You can find more information about this episode at forkingoff.com. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, or wherever you get your podcasts.